Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to try to get started now. My name is Marty. I'm the marketing manager at Oregon State University Press. I want to thank you all for coming virtually to celebrate the launch of Stormbeat, a journalist reports from the Oregon coast by Lori Tobias. I want to give special thanks to the Hoffman Center for the Arts and Dave Dillon for moderating. And I also give a shout out to Cloud and Leaf Bookstore, who are going to be your bookseller for this evening. I'll send you a link to their bookshop later through the chat window. So once we get started, I'll ask everyone to turn off their microphones and cameras so that we can focus on our guest of honor, Lori Tobias, and Dave Dillon will moderate. If you have questions, well, there will be interactive time later in the evening, so feel free to ask questions when we open the microphones back up, or if you don't want to wait, go ahead and send your message through the chat window, and I'll forward those on to Dave. Just as it comes to you during the evening, feel free to do that. So for some of you, Lori needs no introduction. She's a journalist who freelances for local and national outlets, including the New York Times, Seattle Times, Denver Post, and 1859 magazine. Stormbeat is her first book of nonfiction. Her novel Wander won the Nancy Pearl Book Award for Best Book of Fiction from the Pacific Northwest Writers Association. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the hosting controls over to Dave and Lori. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Marty. I'm Dave Dillon with the Hoffman Center for the Arts here in Manzanita, and Lori's 90 miles south of us in Newport, and Marty's, I don't know how far inland Corvallis is from Newport, but the miracle of the modern age. So Lori and I have known each other for a number of years professionally. I was the editor of a small, really small coastal community newspaper, but she was a correspondent for the major daily regional newspaper, the Oregonian, and she ran with the big dogs, and I was just one of the little dogs. So anyway, we're here to help her launch her book, and it's a memoir of her time covering the stories along the Oregon coast, and residents of the coast are going to remember lots of these stories, but now we're going to hear the story behind the stories. Did I get that right, Lori?
Yep, that's pretty much it.
Okay, we'll wrap it up for the evening. So anyway, just to start out, where did you begin? You know, what brought you to the world of words?
Okay, this is going to make everybody laugh, but this is a true thing. I was always a big reader. And so when I was like 12 or 13, I came upon Jacqueline Suzanne. I know. But I was in this conservative little Pennsylvania town. And suddenly I was reading about these people who lived these most glamorous, amazing lives that I couldn't even imagine. And I was so fascinated that somebody could create that world that I could enter. Why my mother was letting me read Jacqueline Suzanne at the age of 12, I have no idea, but that's besides the point. And I think that planted in me this idea of what you could do with words, how you could just open up the world. And so I honestly think that was the impetus. I also had a mother, and you'll see this in the book, who she left us notes every morning on a yellow legal pad, what we were supposed to do, what we were supposed to cook for dinner, not to get in trouble, you know, not to do this, to do that. So that writing, and then my brother went to Vietnam, and so she was always writing my brother in Nam and encouraged us girls to write my brother in Nam. And I think it all just added up, combined with the fact that my father would come home from work and he would tell stories about his day. And I think all of that combined. So I wrote my first poem when I was like 14 years old and heartbroken. And I was so amazed with myself that I could have written this poem, and it all rhymed. But when you create something from nothing, even to this day, I can write the crappiest piece, but the fact that you create it from nothing, it feels so good. It's like this. I was talking to Kim Stafford today, and he used the term, it's a miracle, a blank page, and then you have this miracle. So I left home, went to Alaska and enrolled at the University of Alaska as an English major, go figure, and then switched to journalism and got on with the newspaper, and it just was, I loved it. And so it went from there.
So how'd you end up here on the coast of Oregon?
Well, can I read you a little something?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, I gotta put on my readers, hang on. So I won't make this real long, but and I'll try not to go too fast. I'm not a very good reader. I had come to the coast by way of Pennsylvania, Alaska, Connecticut, Seattle, Southern Oregon, and finally Colorado, where I had a Sunday column and wrote features for the Rocky Mountain News. My husband, Chan, was a power lineman, and so we followed the big construction line jobs, tramping they call it. People felt bad for me moving all the time. I thought I was lucky. Every new town was a fresh adventure, even the grocery store. I wasn't sure I would ever stay in one place, but if we ever did settle down, we always said it would be the Oregon coast. That was our mantra. In 2000, just as the Rocky Mountain News entered into a joint operating agreement with the Denver Post that cast the Rocky as the quote unquote loser, just as I hit a milestone year, just as the 1-year anniversary of the Columbine High School massacre came and went, I saw a help wanted ad for alignment at a Central Coast utility and fired off my husband's resume. That was on a Monday. 1 week later, he interviewed with the Central Lincoln PUD by phone. We flew to Portland Thursday and drove to the coast, where I wrote my Sunday column for the Rocky from a third-story hotel room overlooking the beach. It was foggy and gray, and I thought it was beautiful and romantic and somehow a bit poignant. In Denver, I was invited to restaurant openings, box seats at pro sports games, elite private parties, and social events. I was not the small-town Pennsylvania daughter of a truck driver and waitress, neither of whom had graduated from high school. I was Lori Tobias with the Rocky Mountain News, first and second place winner that year for features and magazine writing from the Colorado Society of Journalists. Who would I be on the Oregon coast? I knew that answer all too well. I would be another struggling writer with the dream of publishing my novel, a dream with a slim, slim chance of coming true. On staff at a newspaper or magazine, my work would be published and read. On my own, there were no such guarantees. They offered Chan the job that afternoon. The Oregon coast. It was supposed to be our version of paradise. We bought a house with views of the ocean, set against a backdrop of towering evergreens and a profusion of flowers that bloomed wild nearly year-round. A place where traffic jams were 2 rounds at the same light and violent crime the exception. And I was miserable. I loved the beauty of the Oregon coast, but I couldn't quite get my head around the idea that this was the end of the road. And I missed the Denver newsroom, missed the parties, the openings, the sun and the snow, even the pro sports, and I missed my friends. I moved from a city where the phone book filled 2 volumes, each as thick as a brick, to one where you could fit the entire directory in a space as slender as a reporter's pad. Voicemail was not an option, and a phone call 20 miles away was long distance. For shopping, there was Fred Meyer, Walmart, and for a time, a small J.C. Penney's housed in a dull gray building adjoining an auto parts store. Alone at my desk, facing the blank screen that was to be my novel, I found myself longing for a column like I'd had at the Rocky, this one to be centered on the Oregon coast. I wrote the editor at the Oregonian to plead my case. I told him how the coast was growing. I suggested stories that I, living in the heart of the coast, was uniquely positioned to write. But the newspaper was cutting positions, not adding. And while I was still held out hope in a Pollyannish sort of way that the news business would rebound, the grim decline had been the story of my career, and it was getting harder and harder to foresee a bright future in the world of paper and ink. So I eked out a living freelancing, something I'd done most of my career. I landed a gig stringing for the New York Times. My first story was about Christian Longo, who murdered his wife and 3 children and threw their bodies in the Yaquina and Alsea Bays. It was only after I filed the story that I learned I would receive no byline. Weeks later, they sent in a correspondent for a more expensive story. He called with instructions on what I was to gather for him. When I balked, he noted I would be paid for my time, of course. It did not escape my attention that overnight I had gone from being a columnist and features writer at one of the largest metro papers in the country to Girl Friday. Mostly I wrote magazine features and travel stories. I flew to Switzerland, Australia, Alaska, the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, usually first or business class, always staying in the best hotels, dining at the finest restaurants. It made for some memorable moments and exposed me to experiences I talk about to this day, good and bad. A couple years after my first note to the editor at the Oregonian, I wrote again. Within an hour of hitting send, I found his reply. I'd just been reading your story in Portland Monthly and wondering if you'd be interested in writing for the Oregonian. Actually, I wasn't. Not news. News, as I recalled it from my early years as a general assignment reporter and then Capitol Bureau Chief for a small Eastern Connecticut daily, meant long hours in mind-numbing meetings, daily monitoring of police reports, long drawn-out courthouse hearings, and covering topics of which I had little interest or worse knowledge. It also meant working long hours for which there would be no overtime pay, a pattern I saw repeatedly in the business. I got the job offer on St. Patrick's Day. My first story would be about a model shipbuilder in North Bend, about 60 miles south of the area we agreed I'd cover. It was an apt beginning. In a short time, I'd be covering all 360 miles of the Oregon coast. Despite my early misgivings, I came quickly to believe that I had been blessed with the best writing gig on earth, albeit a dark one. I was always racing somewhere, and it was rarely for anything good. Often involved death, car crashes, falls, murders, suicide, murder and suicide, drownings, capsizings. God, there were a lot of capsizings. I don't think I'll ever be able to look out over that winter ocean, see the city of lights that is the crab fleet, and not worry, not feel that squeeze in my gut, and wonder not if, but when. Working on the Oregon coast made me a better writer and a better person, but it also made me wary, tentative, watchful. I don't run on the beach without knowing the tide. I don't ever step beyond the signs that warn not to. I don't even get close. And the sound of a sharp bang is never just a backfire, but a potential murder, suicide, or both. I'm sure I've always had some of that wariness in me, but covering the Oregon coast amplified it many times over. Nonetheless, if many of the mileposts along Highway 101 are defined for me by someone else's tragedy, so too are they reminders that I am blessed with having the privilege of working in the most amazing setting, a place where life is authentic and the landscape so stunningly beautiful all these years later, it can still take my breath away.
Thank you. So what you've written here is a memoir of all the stories you've covered. What's in their dark? Are they all dark?
No, but honestly, most are. There's some happy ones. I got kissed by a sea lion from the Oregon Coast Aquarium, and she had been, so they do exercises with them as enrichment, and then they reward them with little fishies. I mean, lots and lots and lots of little fishies. And so they wanted, they said, do you want a kiss from Leah? And I said, sure. And this picture's in the book. And so this sea lion comes up and she sticks her little note, her face up against mine, her little mouth to mine. And then, I kid you not, she belched through her nose. And I can smell her breath of those hundreds of fishies to this day. And then I got to write about a woman that Claire Hall called the Mother Teresa of Lincoln County, and that's Cyntilia McKinley. And if you live around here, you know Tila. And that was a really feel-good story. And one of the things that was so heartening about it was all the people who reached out to help her do what she did, and that is feed the poor, feed the hungry. She will do anything. I mean, she will give the shoes off her feet and walk home barefoot. I think we all kind of worry a little bit about how much she will give. So there were some feel-good stories, sure. You know, there were some features. But yeah, there was a lot of darkness.
Which of those stories stand out, the dark ones? Because I know, like I said, a lot of people here on the coast heard these stories, read these stories from what you published, and tell us some more of the background on them.
I did a lot on the Tacky 2. I wasn't on staff when it happened. Tacky 2 was, I think, they lost 11 people on Father's Day on a recreational fishing boat in 2003. I did the anniversary story in 2004, and then again, I did it. I've done a couple. I did it when the NTSB talked about it. I did another anniversary story, and there was a murder-suicide in Manzanita, Dave, that really bothered me because so many people reached out to me and nobody wanted to believe that it was what the police said. And so you become kind of like a therapist to people. You know, they know you know, and so they call you, they write you, they ask you to do something. And, you know, there's nothing you can do as a journalist but keep trying to shed the light. So that one really haunted me. It stayed with me for a long time because I knew so many details that, so many details.
Do you find people want to talk about these situations?
I'm sorry, Dave, do I find people want to talk about them?
People really do want to talk about these situations when they know the people involved.
That's true. They do, and they want justice to be done. And one thing I learned in that story was no one ever wants to believe it's a murder-suicide. They always want to believe it's a double homicide, which you can understand. One thing I also learned is that when someone is lost and you got the task of calling their family and saying that even it feels intrusive, it feels rude, but a lot of times they actually want to talk to you. They want people to understand why their loved one mattered, who they were, why they loved them. And that actually was the case with London McCabe, whose mother threw him off the Yaquina Bay Bridge, which I have a hard time talking about. In fact, it's one of the first stories. I was no longer on staff, and I actually refused to go out and cover it. Although later I interviewed his father and found that his father, Matt, wanted to talk about his son who was autistic and wanted people to understand why that boy deserved to live a full life. So it's a balancing. You know, some people want to talk to you, some people would just tell you to go to hell.
Have you had good relations with the authorities when you're trying to cover these stories?
By and large, yes. I had such a close relationship with former Tillamook County Sheriff Todd Anderson that I would call and go, "Hey, Todd, it's me." And he knew exactly who me was. And this is before your cell phone identified you, smartphones. I mean, I would just call from my landline. Likewise, I had good relationships with almost all of the authorities, especially once they got to know who I was and they could trust me. There is this thing where, to this day, I get people who write, "Oh, I just got a note yesterday that said, oh, I see you live in Newport now." Well, I've been in Newport for 20 years. But because I was with the Oregonian, they assumed that I'm this coming in from Portland. I'm this outsider. And there's a little bit of sort of like, we don't need you here. We don't need you big city newspaper here. So there was always that to overcome until I got to know people.
When did you realize you had a book on the background of all these stories?
So St. Patrick's Day is March. I knew in October. And
that
I knew
first March and that first October?
Yep. I knew, and I'll tell you why. There was a situation on the North Coast, political infighting, you know, small town, and the fire crew walked off their job in support of their captain or chief. And so I wrote to my editor and said, "Hey," or I think I called him, "Hey, is this a story?" And he's, you know, "Lori, if somebody dies, it's a story, Lori." What he meant was, if there's a fire and someone dies because there were no firemen to go put the fire out, then that's a story. But in this town of like 300 people walking off the job, you know, in Portland, really, who cares? So that happened in the summer. And in the fall, I see this op-ed piece in a little paper up north, and it was really, really sorrowful, but it did not name explicitly what the sorrow was about, just kind of talked about politics and fighting and being unkind to people. So I called a colleague at that newspaper and said, "What is going on?" Well, it turned out the city manager who was responsible for firing the guy who was the fire chief, blah, 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 killed himself. And all I could think of it, "Lori, if someone dies, it's a story." And that story resonated with people. I had people write me from over east and say, "Can we use this because we're having political problems right now? We're having a lot of infighting and people don't understand how this meanness, this name calling, what it does to people." And that was another one of those stories that kind of kept going, and I chose not to share a lot of that because I didn't think it was fair to the family. It was personal stuff that people called and told me, and I opted not to leave it in the book. But I thought about it,
How do you remember all these details to put in your book?
Okay, so I literally have, I'll bet you, every reporter's notebook, but maybe 3. I mean, I have all my reporter's notebooks and I keep journals, and I always have since I'm a very young age. And so when I got laid off and was licking my wounds and knew that I was going to write this book, I sat down and I went through all the reporter's notebooks. I went through all my journals. I went through all my stories. I went through my computer notes, and I made a list on a yellow legal pad on what the stories were that I thought had merit. But more importantly, they couldn't just be a regurgitating of what had been in the Oregonian. They had to have more to it than that. There had to be behind the scenes stuff that people would have never known. There had to be what was going on in my own life. for it to make the cut. And in some ways I regret that, because I've left out a couple stories that I probably wish I had put in, but that was my standard. It had to be more than just what you could have read in the Oregonian. So that was what I held myself to.
More recently, about just a few months ago, you were interviewed on a television network about a story that happened a long time ago, and you just were not comfortable with what the legal process had done to this guy. And then all of a sudden that changed and you're on TV and who is it? What was that story?
So when I took this job, I frequently got emails asking me to cover the story of Leah Freeman from Coos County, who disappeared from Coke Hill. And honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know the year. I'm going to say it was the late 1990s. And finally, it came where I think it would have been her 21st birthday. And so I drove down to Coos Bay and I interviewed her mother, who just didn't want this story to die. She wanted her daughter's killer found. And they had found Leah's body. They had found her shoes in different places. And that her boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, had been a suspect all this time. And when I did this story and they told me they still thought it was Nick, her boyfriend, he was like 17, 18 at the time. And they told me why they thought it was him. I just couldn't get there. There was no evidence. There was just nothing there that I could see that you could, other than that, he was her boyfriend. And what really stuck with me is that he had, they had had a little quarrel. She had taken off. In fact, they didn't even have a quarrel. She had a quarrel with her friend, had taken off from her friends. She was supposed to go meet Nick, disappeared. And he ran around all night looking for her, all night asking, have you seen Leah? Have you seen Leah? I mean, until like 3 a.m. when he was standing outside her house bedroom window looking up. In any case, they convened a grand jury. They got Nick on some charges, and he was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. So when I wrote this book, I wrote that I never believed he was guilty. I just did not believe he was guilty. So I wrote Nick in prison and I said, hey, can you tell me, what you think happened? And he wrote me back and said, thank you, but I'm in the middle of whatever you go through when you get arrested for a crime and you do the time. I can't think of the name right now, but it was something to make sure he got fairness. And I'm sorry, I'm not explaining that very well, but it's like an appeal, but like the next step. So the book's done, and I let it stand at that I never believed he was guilty. And I wrote what he had said to me in the letter, which was just basically, I can't talk to you. And I was back east for my sister's funeral in Pennsylvania. This was in November of last year. And I get a note from a colleague at the Oregonian saying, hey, can you put me in touch with Leah Freeman's family? Nick McGuffin's sentence has been overturned. And Nick served all but 9 months of his sentence. And a judge found that there was DNA evidence that the prosecutor knew about, but everybody just kind of apparently, and again, I'm working off the top of my head, just didn't think it was important enough. And so it was never brought into evidence. It was never acknowledged in the courtroom that there was this DNA that they couldn't identify. And so there was another party involved. There was also a receipt found near her body that they apparently never checked out. So Nick McGuffin has been exonerated, and 2020 came to me and said, they didn't even know about my book, but they just came to me and said, will you do the TV show with us about Nick? And I said yes, and they came to the house and were here for like ever, and we did the story.
You've spent a lifetime writing about people and dark things that happen with people. What have you learned about people and about yourself that you experienced by going through slogging your way through all of that?
I actually I came upon this when I published Wander. First of all, my flip answer to you, Dave, is there's a reason people drink. What I learned is everybody hurts. And you look at people and you think they just have this golden lifestyle, and they have this palatial mansion, and they've got this great marriage, and they've got these chunks of diamonds on their fingers, and everybody hurts. And so I'm not much into pop culture, but sitting around watching TV last night, and I looked at the memorials to Chadwick Boseman, and they showed a video of him, and he said, "The struggles along the way are meant to shape you." I went, whoa. First of all, I hope I'm shaped by now because I'm sick of struggling. But I thought that was like so insightful. We do all struggle in different ways. And when I was on the book tour with Wander, I brought that up, and an old classmate came up to me and she said, "Thank you," because her husband had just died and she was sitting in a diner, and apparently she looked pretty glum, and some guys started going, "Hey, you know, pretty woman smiles, you know, what are you looking so glum about?" And she just really wanted to give them a mouthful about, you know, she was hurting, you know, leave me alone. So that's kind of been my takeaway through this, is we all struggle.
You may just bring up the word, the book. Is that me making noise? Bring up the book Wander. And one of the things I was struck by the book Wander was that all the characters are doing whatever they're doing, but always you had the weather seemed to be another character and an ominous thing underlying everything that happened in that story, you know, affecting people or about to affect people. Does weather, your book's called Storm Beat. Does weather help shape a story when you're trying to explain it to readers?
You know, weather is so much a part of the Oregon coast that it's just second nature. It's instinctual. I mean, there was a period of a few years where I was doing nothing but racing out and covering storms. I mean, big storms. I remember one time they were talking, we were going to have winds over 100 miles per hour. My husband was a lineman at the time, and he knew he was going to go out. And I said to my editor, you know, I'm probably not going to have power this evening. And she said, you know, you still have to follow your story. And so I wrote the top half while we still had power. And then literally there was an explosion of an insulator outside my office window. My husband would tell me that's not literal, but something happened and all the power went out and there was this big boom. And prior to that, I had been listening to the scanner. It was the first time I heard the linemen out working in a storm, and the lines were falling and igniting fires. And, you know, and that was my husband. But what I ended up doing is I came out to my kitchen counter with my cell phone and a candle, and I wrote the story, and I called the newsroom, and I dictated it by cell phone. So yeah, weather has always been a part of this, although perhaps sadly, I feel our weather has changed dramatically, and some people would think this is fortunate. I think we have gorgeous weather anymore. We rarely get those big ass storms, excuse my French. I'm not sure that's a good thing, or maybe it's just a law in the storm. Mm-hmm. And we get snow now. We get snow like every year. We never used to get snow.
Did we get it up here? I don't remember this last
year.
Yeah,
you did. You get it more than we did.
I don't remember everything anymore, so I don't keep notes. So anyway, is there anything else you want to tell people about this book? Things to look for in there, things you learned writing it, and that you learned about the Oregon coast itself?
It's like I said in my prologue, the Oregon coast is an amazing place of, you know, authentic people, working class people. I do think there's a kind of huge dichotomy. We have a lot of really wealthy and we have a lot of really poor. And I think a smaller middle class. I worry about the people on the coast who can't afford to make a living, who can't find housing. I don't know where this is going, but it saddens me. I don't, honestly, 20 years later, after buying this house here with a now distant view of the ocean, I couldn't afford to live here if I had to start now. But it's real, wonderful, as beautiful as any place I think you can. I just think the Oregon coast is absolutely stunning. And I still, like I said in the prologue, the Hubs and I will go out and we'll have dinner on the patio and we'll look out to the ocean or the bay or the bridge. I take my dogs for a little drive. We sit and watch the boats cross the jetty, cross the bar. And I'm still just like, man, how can this place just be this gorgeous?
Sweet. I think we want to open this up. If anybody wants to ask any questions, you can type them in the chat box and Marty will get them to me. I think I've got that set up right now, but what's next for Lori Tobias?
I'm supposed to be working on a book that I have been talking about writing since literally the late 1980s, and that is about being married to a lineman, a tramp lineman. Tramp linemen follow, the big story. They follow the storms. So if the hurricane that just happened down south, he would be calling the hall and saying, "Hey, do you need a lineman?" And if you do, you just jump up and you go. There's no job interviewing. You just show them that you're a journeyman lineman and you go. It's a ridiculously easy way to have an adventure. As I said, I mean, just when you move to a new town, and frankly, I don't know how I don't think I could do this now, just pick up and leave everything and go. But when you do, everything is new and everything's an adventure and it's fun. And it's, when we went back to Pennsylvania, which wouldn't have been my choice, but the school sent him back as an apprentice because my family was there. That allowed us to travel to New York, and we'd spend, in Niagara Falls, and then we moved to Connecticut, and you're not going to stay, so you act like you act like a tourist. You see everything while you can, because you're not going to stay there. And I think some people, would find that laughable, but I got to see a lot of cool places. I probably, we would drive up to Boston, Rhode Island, Martha's Vineyard, New York City. There's a great deal of fun of being able to do that. And so when we did move out here, it took me years to get my head around the fact that I was not going anywhere else. And for years, I was just always naturally, where next, where next, where next, where we going next.
Well, I find it a great place to have settled too. So, we have a question up here. Can Lori highlight any other local known stories covered in Stormbeat? I don't know which local area. Obviously, there are ones in our area, but other big stories.
Well, that's all the book is.
Yeah.
It's chronological, and so it's all the big stories from that time period. So I freelanced for the Oregonian, but that was more features. And when I came on as a correspondent, and then a couple of years later after that as a staff writer, whatever was happening, if there was a capsizing, if there was whatever was the big story, but they are all the Oregon coast. I wrote about rappelling out of a helicopter up in Astoria and ending up with vertigo, which is kind of permanent. I wrote about, you asked me about happy stories. I hiked the Fort to Sea Trail, which should have been fun, but you're gonna have to read the book to find that one out.
Oh, okay. See Cloud and Leaf and their online store. Let's see. Could you ever find your own story ideas, or did they all have to come from the boss?
Oh no. What you find, and I learned this a long time ago, is once you do one story, it will inevitably lead to another. So sometimes, obviously my editor would call and say, you need to look into this story. But I would say more than half the time, I was the one calling, going, "Hey, this is happening, and I think we need to do this." And that could have been anything from just anything from the wave buoys that we were going to have. I mean, there was at one time, there were 3 or 4 companies going to put a wave buoy, energy on the coast. It might be something happening at the Coast Aquarium. It might be the rehabilitation of the lighthouse. It might be vandalism of the lighthouse. It might be a crime.
A call in the middle of the night. Look for
or a call in the middle of the night, or tsunami warnings, or
I remember that one. Does somebody ask here, is your overarching, well, we got so many different kinds of communities on the coast, is your overarching impression that Oregon coast people and stories are fundamentally different than in other places? Are we all just the same in the end?
I think they are different. Just in the same way that, like if you live in Colorado, you'll hear accidents on the ski slopes. This is just an example. Here, you're going to hear capsizings, issues to do with the fishing community, issues to do with the logging community, issues to do with the tourism. And so there's a lot going on here. And Dave, as you know, as anybody who lives on the coast knows, it's a rugged, beautiful place, but you have to pay attention. You can't ignore the warnings about things because there's a lot of risk here. And if you're not being careful, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah, I know in another interview I heard you on, you talked about people who just don't pay attention to the signs, says don't go past here. Well, people go past there and become a story. So you've run
And they
into
fall
that.
to your death. They fall to their death. This actually happened. Some guy climbed over the ropes, fell to his death. I did the story, and I don't know if it was a police officer or a ranger or whoever said, this is why we post the signs. He wasn't being mean. He was trying to say to other people, don't do it. And I just got so attacked, and so did he, because we were unsympathetic and unkind. What people don't understand is you have to actually take a story like that. And while you do have to be compassionate and empathetic and all that, you also have to point out that this is how it and why it happened. And if people continue to do that, one of the scariest things I ever saw was when I first moved here and I was running on the beach, and you learn the warnings. Don't turn your back on the beach, but also people who don't live out here may not know that our ocean is full of waterlogged timbers, huge. They weigh tons. And they will come in, and if they're laying on the beach, the water will lift them. So if you're sitting on it, you can get trapped under them. So I'm running on the beach, I look out, and there are two girls, probably, I don't know, 11 to 14, straddling one of these massive timbers and riding the waves in it. And I screamed at them at the top of my lungs, but you can't be hurt over the ocean. I mean, they were quite a bit out there. Obviously, they survived it because I never heard otherwise, but that's the kind of thing that obviously they just didn't know how endangered they were.
Yeah. We all have had those experiences. What made your dad such a good storyteller? You say your mom would set an example for you by writing frequently, but would you say your dad influenced your writing voice more?
Boy, I don't know. Toby was just, this is an example of who my dad was. So we'd go someplace and he'd see somebody and they'd have a conversation. I'd say, Dad, I didn't know you knew him. And he'd go, well, I don't really, dear. And he would just have these conversations. And he would, sit on our front porch, and somebody be driving through town, they'd pull over and they'd come sit on the front porch, and then they'd start, telling their tales about just not big things, not important things, just something funny that happened that day, or something that was kind of a head scratcher that, that they just didn't quite get. And he talked to everybody.
And you talk to everybody too when you write stories.
I do kind of, don't I?
This might be one last one. When you came to the coast, I assume there were things that you expected to see. What were some of the things that pleasantly surprised you? I mean, you came from,
well,
no beaches there, isn't it?
the moderate temperatures. I mean, the moderate temperatures I hadn't expected. Honestly, I was so, for lack of a better word, in love with the coast. I was so dazzled by it, so wanted to settle here, that could not be any unpleasant surprises or any pleasant surprises, because I just thought there could be no wrong here. So there were some unpleasant surprises. And one of them that really I had a hard time with is how dark it is in the winter compared to Denver. And I still don't really quite get that, but it's just a darker winter. I don't think I knew how big the winds could get, but that didn't bother me. I like a good winter storm. If you want to go shopping, well, back in the day now, but back in the day, if you want to go shopping, you'd either drive 2.5 hours to Portland, which is now more like 3.5 hours to Portland, or you could go to Salem, or you could go to Eugene. But here on the coast, unless you're up in Warrington, where they do have a Home Depot and da-da-da-da-da. But here back then, if you wanted to seriously go shopping, like you needed a Nordstrom's fix, you were driving 3 hours, because it wasn't happening here. Mm-hmm. And you know what else? That there's not a lot of opportunity to get your high heels on and your cocktail dress and your red lipstick. That just isn't. I used to go around and ask people, could you just like host a party, like a black tie party, so we can get dressed up?
I think you missed Colorado. So, yeah.
Well, I I love Colorado, but and I love the Rocky Mountain News. That was kind of like what your hometown is when you're a kid. The Rocky was kind of, as a journalist, my hometown. They took good care of me. I'm looking at Mary over there in the corner. She was my editor, and I always called her my surrogate big sister. But the coast is, my husband and I both feel we need to be near the water, and I can't imagine not living here.
Well, thank you, Lori. This is the first book launch from the Hoffman Center, and online, excuse me, we've launched others here before. Back in remember the old days when people could gather in one room? I remember those fondly too.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a part of this. And we know because you've had a good connection with us and with this part of the coast. And a note here from Marty says, we're going to post a recording of tonight's event. So watch our Facebook page for details. This Facebook page for Oregon State University Press. And so people that didn't get to watch it can watch it later, or you can go back and catch all the wonderful stuff. Is there anything else you want to talk about that I didn't ask, you didn't think to say, please?
Yeah, there is. I want to thank OSU, because I don't think there could have been a better publisher for this book. This is where this book belongs, and I am inordinately proud of being part of that. I want to thank the Hoffman Center for not only co-hosting this, but for taking me under your wing, Dave, back with Wander. I want to thank Cloud and Leaf and all the bookstores, Nye Beach Books here in Newport, Beach Books in Seaside. We have wonderful independent bookstores, and I hope we will all remember to order books from them when we can. And let's see what else. And I want to thank my husband, who I'm gonna joke up. Without Chan, none of this happens. That's the truth. That's just the truth, and it always has been. He has been the guy who has been willing to go to work so Lori could sit there and write, indulge her passion to write. And sure, when I was in a city and at a metro newspaper, that was no big deal. But when I'm freelancing, that's a very iffy, inconsistent kind of living. And he never, ever complained that, hey, if you'd actually go get a real job, we wouldn't be, counting pennies. So he is my rock.
Thank you. Hey, Marty invites everybody to unmute their microphones and turn on their cameras and
Dude, unmute your microphones, unmute your cameras, say hey.
say hey. And then,
What about your dogs?
My dogs, actually Luna was here jumping up on my knee when I was trying to talk. And
You rescue dogs. You forgot to say that.
yeah, I do. And Chan is under marching orders. He's not allowed to move, because if he moves near me, Luna will go ballistic and try to bite him. So
Good dog. Good dog.
well,
Hi, Lori. Congratulations.
thank you. Cheryl, we miss you.
Carol.
Hi, Mark, Sally,
Great
we
job,
got people,
Lori.
Mary, we got people from Pennsylvania, Colorado, the coast, Paul and Evelyn. Paul and Evelyn, actually, when I did Wander, I was such a mess about doing stage readings, and they tried so hard to help me like settle down, and just having that kind of faith in you and that willingness to help you. I don't know that I ever really got comfortable on stage,
Oh,
but just
yeah.
knowing that people are taking care of you matters tremendously.
Oh, it shows, Lori. It really shows.
Oh, Paul, I'm in my living room, for heaven's sakes. If I were on stage, my mouth would be dry, my knees would be trembling, my hands would be shaking. I'd be.
You did a great job at the library for Wander.
Well, thank you. I didn't feel that way, but thank you. Rose, I want you guys to know Rose Kolonowski and I have known each other since 5th grade, 4th grade. Tama's on here somewhere, I think. Tama and I met in 3rd grade when I gave her my milk and she gave me her cookies because I wouldn't drink milk. So I guess if there was anything else I was going to say is I have an amazing, amazing community of friends across this country who have always been willing to read my work and pat me on the back. And
Well, you're an amazing person, and this is brilliant. I can't wait to read it. I loved Wander. I'm just so excited for you. What a great night.
Thank you.
and thank you, everybody, for being here. And I guess we're going to wrap it up.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Dave.
Bye-bye,
You're great,
everybody.
Lori.
Bye.
Bye.
Wonderful. Bye.
Thank you.